It was back in the year 1993 that our family, being a responsible set of individuals, sat around the kitchen table debating how we could possibly help raise some money for BBC Children in Need. Various ideas were forthcoming, but association football looms large in this family, certainly with the two boys and I, and a seemingly manageable and doable idea would be to assemble a collection of pennants from the 92 professional football league clubs and then auction them as a job lot. If you're not familiar with what football pennants are, they would usually be a triangular shaped small flag with the club name, the crest, and usually in the club colours. And back in the day when I first went to football matches, these were one of the very few items you could buy in support of your team, along with perhaps a scarf or a bobble hat, compared with these days when you can buy complete club strips from the club shop, so much more nowadays. Anyway, the amount raised by the sale and the auction of these pennants would be our contribution to BBC Children in Need. Importantly, it wouldn't involve each club in very much effort or expense. These pennants typically would cost the club, I guess, £1 or £2 at the most. And we hadn't heard, very importantly, of anyone else doing this previously. So, grabbing the bull by the horns, the children compiled and signed a handwritten letter explaining what they were doing and how they could help us, how the clubs could help us. And we acquired a copy of the FA yearbook, which contained the names of all of the club's commercial managers. We also thought it would be a good idea to enclose a large stamped address return envelope to make the club's job easier. Basically, all they'd have to do is pick a pennant off the shelf, stick it in the envelope and stick the letter back in the postbox. Now, within a couple of weeks, we had around half of the pennants, that's about 50 it was, plus lots of other signed memorabilia we hadn't asked for, which was fantastic. By coincidence, at the time I'd been introduced to a gentleman by the name of Alec King, who was then Sunderland AFC's club secretary. My company had a box at Roker Park, that legendary ground loved by generations of Sunderland supporters prior to the move to the brand new Stadium of Light in 1997. I went to see Mr. King, told him what we had done and were doing, and could he do anything to help us secure the balance of 40 or so pennants. And he suggested that if I were to attach a Sunderland AFC compliment slip with a note from him saying you'd be doing this family a great favour if you would slip a pennant in an envelope for them as a contribution to Children in Need, it ought to help in our efforts to acquire some of the outstanding ones. He was quite right. It did help a lot. It was an excellent idea. We took the trouble as well to let BBC Radio Newcastle Children in Need office know what we were doing, and they passed that on to BBC Children in Need Appeal headquarters in London. I then received a phone call on behalf of Eddie Mayer, the well-known radio presenter who was then responsible for the lunchtime programme on Radio 5 Live. Was I ever in London? Yes. Could I come into the BBC and talk about this live on air? Try stopping me. Anyway, the day arrived shortly afterwards when I was in London on business, and an arrangement was made for me to go to the BBC. I was ushered into Radio 5 Live, and the traffic news lady, I think her name was Lynn Bowles, welcomed me and saw to it that I had a cup of coffee before being brought into Eddie Mayer's presence. He sat me down in the studio directly opposite him, and we chatted briefly off-air while some music was playing. He then explained that he would be turning either to me or to Ken Clarke in the radio car, and at this moment he did not know which. Ken Clarke at that time was a Tory government minister. Now in 2024 he is the recently retired Father of the House of Commons, a title bestowed upon the MP with the longest record of continuous service. In his case, he became an MP in 1970, so 50 plus years in the House of Commons, and nowadays a voice sorely missed in parliamentary debates. I relaxed in the knowledge that a government minister would rate slightly higher in the mind of both the presenter and of the listening nation than a one-off visit from a bloke from the northeast talking about football pennants. I confess, I switched off a little. Now, opposite me, I have Rob Barnes, whose family has been collecting football pennants for children in need. Tell me, Rob, do you have any other collections? The words registered. It was me, not Ken Clarke. The red light on my microphone shone brightly, telling me that the nation was holding its collective breath, waiting for some words of wisdom. What a question! Talk about being blindsided by the presenter. Not having consciously collected anything of note over the preceding 40-plus years of my life, apart from stamps and dead flies on the front of my car, neither of which was likely to lead to riveting conversation, the only thing I could think of was that over the previous 10 years or so, we had 4 Citroën 2CVs in the family. That at least made Mr. Mayor laugh. The ice was broken, and so we set off into an amiable and comfortable discussion about the collection of football pennants, but without mentioning that all of this happened so quickly that we were still about 15 pennants short of our total bag full. On the back of this, someone bid the princely sum of £600 on the Radio 5 live auction, a brilliant result. But that wasn't the end of the story. Fast forward 11 years to 2004. Following that halcyon day with Eddie Mayer at the BBC in London, he or she who offered the £600 donated the money but never followed through with a name and address. The BBC couldn't help with this, and so the bag of football club pennants, minus at that point the few needed to complete the full set, was temporarily filed in our loft and, it must be said, forgotten about. By this time, children had grown up and all bar one had left home, and it was only due to a household reshuffle that the large blue bag was recovered from under a pile of similar bags full of clothing and other discarded stuff. Right, we need to get this show on the road, complete the set of pennants, fill the bag and auction it off again for children in need. My job entailed many a tour of the country, so I made it my business to ensure that I visited the few clubs whose pennants I didn't have and persuade them to contribute to the collection. I shall say straight away that they were only too pleased to help. MK Dons didn't have pennants, so they gave me some free matchday tickets and other memorabilia instead. And as for Kidderminster Harriers, well, I'll tell you about them in a couple of minutes. But within a short space of time, I was down to just one club who chose not to participate in this goodwill gesture to enable us to complete the set of 92. Yes, I know I could have bought one, but that would have spoiled the effect. After 2 visits and being unable to see anyone who could or would help me, I came across a sympathetic receptionist at Newcastle United, them being the then unhelpful club, although I'm sure that the recent regime change there will have led to a more enlightened approach. Fair to say they had a well-known reputation at that time for not entertaining charitable donations of this sort, so would they be shamed into it. The receptionist asked someone to come out and see me. This person listened to my story, looked exasperated and defensive in equal measure, probably not helped by me saying that I was due on Radio Newcastle the following day, and it wouldn't look very good if the only club in the Football League not to help me was... She narrowed her eyes and sharply told me to wait here, and promptly disappeared from whence she came. 5 minutes later she returned, clutching a large brown envelope. To quote her exact words, "I haven't given you this. This is nothing to do with me." And with a slight lack of good grace, she turned and exited the reception area. The receptionist and I exchanged triumphant smiles. Yes, I had the complete set and just in time for my radio appearance on Children in Need Day 2004. The live appearance at BBC Radio Newcastle was a rather strange affair. The interview, conducted by BBC presenter Martin Emerson, was fine and friendly, and he was, let's say, intrigued by the gift from Newcastle United, as he was well aware of their stingy reputation. Then, a few minutes into the interview, Mr. Emerson was bodily picked up by two pranksters known as the Two Dafties, and who, by listening to their voices on my cassette tape of the programme, sound uncannily like the Hairy Bikers. I wonder if it was them. Just carry on, Robert. Tell the audience a story about your penance. As he disappeared out of the studio door, leaving me on my own with a live microphone and an audience waiting for pearls of wisdom, if only I could instantly think of some. My Kidderminster Harriers story, fortunately, came to mind. They were a club relatively new to the bottom tier of professional football. They have incidentally since dropped out of the Football League, back to non-league. But when I called at their ground, the Agborough Stadium, I was told that they didn't have any pennants. They had things like mugs, but not pennants. Silence ensued in the office, but then Jenny, their commercial manager, said, "But we had 100 pennants made when we were promoted into the Football League. And this one hanging on the wall here is actually the only one left. You can have it." I can't think of a better place for it to go. Now, eyes began to water on both sides of the counter, and I respectfully refused her kind offer, but also, seeing that it would genuinely mean a lot to her if I would accept it, in the end, I graciously did. So full marks to one of football's minnows, who showed the way in terms of real generosity. By the time I'd finished this story, Martin Emerson had been released by the Two Dafties, and the conversation began again. It was a lovely experience all round, and one which kindled my desire to somehow get involved with radio, more of which in another little story in this collection. The full collection of pennants and memorabilia were auctioned once again, and the highest bidder was the school in Gateshead, and I'm sure that the pennants are still flying high there on a classroom wall. As a short postscript, I never did get a recording of my BBC London interview. I did for the BBC Newcastle one with Martin Emerson, and it still works and is among my few remaining cassette tapes.